Thank you all so much for joining us today in our second class of our series. As I mentioned, you can sign up for individual classes or the whole series. Today we are talking about pruning landscape trees, and we have Ray Tackett, the Bourbon County Extension Agent for Horticulture, and he is, of course, partners in our series here as well. So thanks so much, Ray, for doing this class.
All righty, are we ready to go, Faye?
We're ready to go.
All righty, we'll go ahead and kick it off. I have a presentation today, and we'll leave time at the end of the program to do question and answers, as they mentioned before in the other class of the series. Just if you have questions, find your chat box and put it in there, and someone will be moderating and reviewing that. And at the end of the program, we'll be sure to look at those questions. But pruning landscape trees, most of what I'll say in the presentation today will also apply to your landscape shrubs. But today we're specifically talking about trees, which are a little different. They get bigger and they're a little harder to deal with. If you put off pruning until the tree gets older, it becomes very difficult to do pruning chores then. But there's a lot of different reasons that we prune landscape trees, and I've listed some of the most common reasons that we prune landscape trees. Probably the most common reason we prune landscape trees is to control the plant size and form. More to control the plant size rather than the form, because as I'll say in a later slide, I have a couple of slides on tree form. You have to pay close attention to tree form because you can't significantly change a tree form through pruning. You're just fighting a losing battle by doing that. Another reason that we prune landscape trees is to enhance flowering or fruiting. Of course, if you have something like an apple tree or a pear tree, there's very specific methods that you'll use to prune those trees. We won't really get into the specifics of fruit trees today, but the general principles that I'll talk about today on pruning trees apply to fruit trees as well. And of course, if you have flowering trees, there's more specific times that you'll want to review of when you prune specific trees based on their flowering times, and I'll have a slide on that later in the presentation. In some cases, we may want to rejuvenate old plants. That's more common in shrubs than it is in trees, but if you're dealing specifically with something like a fruit tree, an old apple tree, it's pretty common to want to rejuvenate those trees. And then the last thing on the list here is training. And you'll notice I use the word training rather than pruning, but training of young trees. When you first put those out, the first 5 years of pruning or training is absolutely critical to the life of that tree. That's when you set the scaffold limbs and the overall shape of the tree. And you'll do, in some trees, the first 5 to 6 years, you'll do your pruning, and then you may not prune that tree for the rest of its life. You've done significant pruning then on small branches, you've set the overall structure of the tree, and you're done. So to me, out of this list, training is probably the most important pruning you'll ever do. And if you're lucky enough to put out young trees, just pay particular attention to those slides that apply to that in the presentation today. Very, very important training when trees are young. Some common tree problems that I see day in and day out, and when I walk up to trees, and I'm working with parks here lately, I've done a lot of work with the Bourbon County Park System. We've been doing tree assessments in the community. These are some of the common things that I see both with homeowners and with municipalities, places like cities and communities. When I walk up to trees, these are some of the first things that I look for. I look for things like sets of codominant stems. This is a tree that would have been a better tree if it had had one main scaffolding system up through the center of the tree, but because it wasn't pruned young, these codominant stems were allowed to develop. Another thing I look for, and we'll talk a lot about in the presentation, is included bark. Now, included bark is this area here. That's inherently weak. You need to watch for that on trees when you're going to, that counts for young trees and old trees. If you have a property, let's say you buy a home and it's got old trees, you really need to look for that included bark because those are weak limb angles. And a lot of times, if the tree's younger, you can remove the limbs when they're young and really stop some problems as a tree gets older. Of course, I always look for dead branches. That's pretty common, especially, you know, I still see dead branches on farms and homes around homes here in Bourbon County from ice storms that we had years ago. Those trees were never cleaned up. So we have a lot of dead branches, not only dead branches, but even worse, we have these broken branches. And these are really dangerous because they're hinged. And as the wind blows and as that branch ages, they can become what we call deadfalls. And we use the word dead in there for a reason. It indicates that they're very dangerous. You have to be very careful of these broken branches uh, because they can just fall out and cause a lot of damage to people or property. And something else I look for is decay in the tree. Here is an example of decay, probably from a limb that was removed after it had gotten very large, and you didn't get complete callusing around that pruning cut. And that's pretty common. The bigger the limb, the harder it will be for the tree to callus up that pruning cut. Another thing I see a lot and I look for is suckers. Now you'll notice there is a difference between a sucker here and a water sprout. A water sprout is up in the tree and it's these little pencil thin, bushy, this growth up in the tree. And it's a pretty common thing to see, especially the year after a heavy pruning. A lot of times you'll get lots of water sprouts, but I hear folks a lot of times using the terms water sprouts and suckers interchangeably. But they're not really interchangeable, and I have to be careful how I use them because water sprouts are up in the tree. It's this thick, dense growth, and suckers grow off of the roots primarily at the base of the tree. So that's suckers and water sprouts. I look for both of those in a tree, and both elements of a tree is undesirable. Over the next few minutes, we'll talk about just some general tree pruning concepts that applies to most situations in your home landscape, most trees and most situations in your home landscapes. These are kind of rules of thumb. These are the big concepts of the presentation today. These are the things to remember that applies not only to trees, but they apply to shrubs primarily also. First of all, the timing of pruning is probably the most common question I get here at the office. People ask, when's the best time to prune trees in Kentucky? And almost without exception, I tell them early spring is a great time for most shade trees in Kentucky for many different reasons. One of the reasons is that the structure of the tree is bare. You'll notice this guy on the right here that's doing some pruning up in the tree. You can see that tree highlighted on the skyline. You can see every branch in that tree. So it's a great time to prune that tree in early spring. We're talking about March and April. It's a little different if you have a flowering tree. We'll talk about that in a few minutes because you may have to change your timing a little bit. But in most general situations, if you don't have a tree that's valued for fruit or flowers, early spring is a great time to prune in Kentucky. The structure is easy to see, but not only that, the limbs weigh a lot less. Why do the limbs weigh less? It's because they don't have all of those leaves on the limbs yet, so it's safer for you or someone you're working with to get up into the tree and do the pruning cuts they need to make. Another big reason is this reason here is that trees are able to close and seal up pruning cuts way more easily in the spring than they are at any other time of the year, because what's that tree doing in the spring? It's waking up, the tissues are waking up, they're in a growth mode. So pruning cuts you make in the spring, they callus up a lot better at that time. And here's just a couple examples. That's just a kind of a drawing of examples of, let's say this pruning cut was made in July or August, and it was a rather large pruning cut, and you got some decay here, and you got irregular callusing going on. If that cut were made in the spring, maybe it would look more like this. The tree was able to more uniformly callus up that pruning cut, and you don't have as much decay in some situations. So that's why spring is such a great time to do a lot of pruning chores. My favorite reason is that as I can actually see the limbs that I'm pruning. Once you get up in the year, unless it's an emergency pruning, once you get into late summer, you shouldn't be doing any pruning. You don't want to prune too much beyond midsummer because that'll cause some unwanted growth that'll get killed back in the winter. But most of my pruning that I do is in the spring. It's a lot better situation. Insect decay, diseases are all discouraged at that time for the most part, and it just looks better. I also get the question of if you're pruning something like a maple tree that bleed or they leak a lot of sap when you prune early in the spring. First of all, that really doesn't hurt the tree. Research and information has shown us over time that it really doesn't have a negative effect on the tree. But if you have a car parked under that maple tree that you've just pruned in March and it's leaking all over the place, that's not a good situation. So how you deal with that is you just wait for those trees that bleed a lot. We're talking about things like white pines and maples, any of the resinous evergreens, and a lot of the deciduous trees. They'll tend to bleed a lot. And if you know that tree is going to bleed, just prune it later in the year after June the 1st, and you'll greatly reduce the sap that comes out of that tree. Now, if you have trees such as dogwoods, redbuds, smoke trees, sourwoods, trees that you value for their flowering, adhere to these rules of thumb on this page. Everything's based on an average date of June the 1st in Kentucky. If trees flower before June 1, prune it after flowering. And if a tree flowers after June 1, you can prune that early in the spring before the flower buds are visible. That's the rule of thumb of pruning trees that you prize for their blooms. And for the most part, it works pretty well. Just a couple words about tree form. I mentioned that in the first couple of slides, is that the main thing to remember about tree form, first of all, trees come in all shapes and sizes, and you're never going to take a tree like this spreading tree, let's call it an elm tree, you're never going to take that tree and do a good job of making it look like this tree. A lot of times I see a spreading type tree put very close to a house, and what happens then? What do you have to do? You have to aggressively prune that tree to the point to where you're damaging the tree greatly. If you put a spreading tree too close to a home, you try to prune it into, let's say, a conical shape. And that's not going to be good on the tree. It's going to greatly reduce the life of the tree. Most trees can't handle that. It's going to be an undesirable situation, and the only thing you can do there is just research the general growth form of a tree, the tree form itself, before you put that in the ground, because there's a big difference between, let's say, a columnar tree and a spreading tree. There's a big difference. The main takeaway on this slide is don't try to change the general shape or form of a tree. It usually doesn't work out well. Another good concept to remember when we're pruning trees is it's better to prune smaller branches. The smaller a branch is when it's removed, the better it's going to close the wound, the better it's going to callus and close up, because the tree doesn't have as big a wound to deal with. It sort of makes sense. The same rule of thumb applies to wounds that we have. Another rule of thumb is, and you'll see me say this several times in the presentation, another rule of thumb is only remove about a third or less of a total leaf mass of a plant at one time. If you remove more than a third for small or large trees, what you're going to do is you're going to shock that tree and you're going to cause a lot of growth, undesirable growth to bloom up in that tree. That's why when we see trees that are topped, which is really, really undesirable, I'll say a lot of bad things about tree topping in a few minutes, but when you see trees that are topped, let's say a maple tree that's 20-year-old maple, a lot of times you'll see a really bushy growth that'll spring back the next year, and that growth may grow 20 foot in 1 year. It's amazing how much growth you're going to get, but is that really rapid, fast, soft growth? Is that strong growth that you want? No. And the less that you prune out of a tree, the less likelihood you have of that tree having a reaction and sending up a bunch of that growth that you don't want. Some considerations, especially when I'm working with larger farms or cities. This is a sheet that I give out to landowners that have a lot of trees, is that when I'm making decisions on whether or not to remove a tree branch, I look at the size of that tree branch in relation to the tree trunk. If that tree branch is less than 1/2 the trunk diameter, it's usually not, if I make a good pruning cut, it's usually not going to cause me a lot of problems. Remove if you need to. Remove limbs that are 1/2 the trunk diameter or less. Now, as you get into bigger limbs, 1/3 to 1/2 the trunk diameter, you have to be very careful about pruning cuts there. You have to make a great pruning cut. And even if you do make a good pruning cut, you may still have some things like decay and defects that come as a result of those large limb prunings. Now, limbs that are even larger than 1/2 the diameter of the trunk, defects are almost guaranteed. Another good option, if you can do it, rather than removing a really, really big limb, is to head that limb back, and we'll talk more about that in just a second, is to shorten that limb rather than removing it all the way back to the trunk. If you remove that all the way back to the trunk, it's most likely going to result in some rot and other undesirable wood decay, insect damage, so on. When I look at trees or I look at shrubs, there's basically in my head 2 types of pruning cuts. And the first one is a reduction cut, and the second one is a removal cut. A reduction cut does exactly what it says, is it reduces the length of a limb to a smaller limb in this case. And here's the smaller limb here. You're reducing the length of a stem by pruning back to a smaller limb. Here is the pruning cut here, and you'll notice this is the smaller limb here. A removal cut is a little bit more drastic. That's when you remove a limb all the way back to the trunk. And I don't use removal cuts very often unless it's a situation that I have no other choice. That's where you prune a branch back to a trunk or parent branch. In this situation, it's not so bad because you have a smaller limb that you've pruned all the way back to what I'm going to say is a larger limb. It's a removal cut because you remove that entire limb structure. But if I have my choice, I always use reduction cuts in landscaping. I remove limbs back to a smaller growing point, in this case, a smaller limb, not all the way back to the trunk. So 2 types of cuts, reduction cuts and removal cuts. Here's a little bit more of a diagram on just pruning to reduce. Once again, reduction cuts are the recommended method for your landscape trees in most situations. But you'll notice something here. This is a tree. This is the outside. This is the outside of a tree here. Most reduction cuts are not made to the interior of the tree here. Most reduction cuts happen here. You're reducing generally the outside limbs of a tree. Reduction cuts, and you'll look at every single one of these cuts in the diagram, and each one of these cuts is made back to a living point, which is a huge concept in pruning. You always prune back to a living point, which is a bud or a branch, but you'll notice that each one of these cuts is made back to a smaller branch. That's a classic reduction cut. Sometimes I believe that's how topping came about, as people observed arborists making reduction cuts, and then they tried to apply that same concept at home, but they didn't do it properly. They just sort of buzz cut their trees, and that's not a good situation. So to do a proper reduction cut, if you look at a proper reduction cut job on a tree, it reduces the size of the tree while maintaining the form. Reduction cuts don't change the form of the tree, topping does. If you do reduction cuts properly, you minimize regrowth, and that's good. And if you do a reduction cut properly, the cuts are barely noticeable. It's a very natural looking tree form once you're done with that type of pruning cut. And the branch tips are visible in the outside canopy, meaning you didn't buzz cut and all you see are dead tree snags. You don't see that. It actually still looks like a natural tree once you're done with reduction cuts. You can bring a tree back a little bit in height with reduction cuts, not drastically, but you can reduce the overall size of a tree some using that method. Now, if you don't do that correctly, if you just top a tree, that's really a drastic form in a tree structure. If you see a tree that's been topped, you know it. It doesn't look like the original tree at all. You'll see a lot of sprouting. The cuts are very noticeable. The tree structure is not the same. It's greatly weakened. And if if a tree was topped a few years ago, you can see a lot of defects and decay in that tree. All of those are bad situations. So, but I believe that's why trees are topped. People just didn't pay attention to what a reduction cut really is, and they tried to apply that same method at home. You can greatly improve that by what we just talked about, pruning back to a living point, in this case, smaller branches. Just a picture. Most of us don't need to see a picture of a tree that's been topped. There's a lot of those in communities, but tree topping does a lot of things to the tree. You've removed a lot of branches. You have a lot of stubs. And what you get is a lot of unnatural, wispy looking regrowth. When you top a tree, you remove large amounts of branch tissue that really is the energy source for the tree. You've removed leaves. You've shocked the tree. You've created large wounds. Not only that, but I see trees that have been topped. I'll get a call later that year after a tree's been topped and they say, all of my leaves are scorched. What's going on? And those leaves will be down in the tree. Well, what they've done is they've opened up those leaves to sun scald. That's something we don't think about a whole lot. And then the next year after topping, you get a rapid regrowth because the tree has sort of been shocked. And that rapid regrowth is, once again, it's very soft and it's prone to failure. And it just destroys the natural form of the tree and greatly reduces the overall life of the tree. I do realize that, you know, we're not all so lucky to have planted and cared for a tree when it was young, and you may have purchased a property that had an old tree and that was your only option. Or you may be in a city where the city pruners are going through and cutting. They had no other option rather than to top a tree. But my assumption is once a tree's been topped, its life is just reduced greatly after that. And in a few years, it should come out. Here's a look at a tree that's been topped. The cut was made here. And look at all of this rot from a tree that was just been indiscriminately cut on. You have all this columnar rot that goes down in those branches, and in that you have insects, you have diseases, and all of those things just reduce the life of a tree. Reduction in this situation, it's going to help you a little bit. Is it going to solve the problem? No. The power lines, this tree has grown straight up into the power lines. Reduction cuts, even proper reduction cuts, may buy you 2 to 3 years in this situation, but the ultimate solution will be just to take that tree out and put something back in that spot that's more appropriate, or nothing at all in this case. Maybe a shrub is better. Maybe a tree's not going to work here at all. But reduction cuts, even with proper cuts, you can't drastically, you know, reduce a tree that's typically 40 foot tall. You can't make that 40-foot tall tree. You can't ever make it a 20-foot tall tree and keep it at that height and keep it healthy. So it's important to know a little bit about the trees that you're planting, their ultimate height, their ultimate form. But even using good cuts, it doesn't always solve the situation, especially in this situation here. The most important pruning I think you'll ever do to a tree, once again, pruning, or sometimes I call it training, is in the first 5 years. Some things to remember in the first 5 years of working with the tree in your landscape is that the branches that you see on that tree are temporary. Those branches are not the branches you're going to have when that's a 25-year-old tree. Just kind of keep that in mind. Keep in mind the rule of don't remove more than 30% of live foliage, especially on freshly planted trees. I also like to reduce all branches greater than 1/2 trunk diameter. If branches are 1/2 trunk diameter or greater, they're going to either compete with the central leader or trunk of the tree, or they're going to grow down low on a young tree and become a problem later on. You're going to have to make a big pruning cut. If you don't remove those now, you'll have to remove those years down the road, and it's going to be a much larger wound for the tree to heal. Reduce or remove all branches or stems that are competing with the one central leader. Now, some trees I realize, trees like paperbark birch, they are natural multi-stemmed trees, and you need to know that. They may be a tree that you'll not necessarily have as a central leader tree, but a lot of landscape trees, evergreens and deciduous trees, the best structure for those is a central leader. So any branches that are growing up and you see a multi-leader situation, I'll have a picture of this in a second, that needs to be addressed right away. And this is good. I think this is a good picture of a tree. It's a young tree, 5, 8 years old, still in the nursery. And you have these leaders that are going to compete with this central leader. This one, I want this to be the central leader of my tree in the center of that picture. So what you do is you make those cuts, you head those limbs back. The cut was made, if you'll see in the picture to the right, the cuts were made here. And the old limbs were here and they were removed. This tree on the right is, you've just really improved the life of that tree. If that tree lives to be 100 years old, it'll be a much healthier tree all throughout its life based on those easy, quick pruning cuts you made when that tree was small. Those small pruning cuts make more difference than 100 hours of pruning when that tree's 20 years old. So you really set your scaffold limbs, you deal with the leaders, you direct growth when trees are young, and that's your best pruning cuts. It really is. A little bit more about when I'm assessing trees, deciding what to prune out. I'll go through these fairly quickly. We've talked about some of these. Is, of course, we always prune out and look for dead branches. That's a given. Broken branches, you'll see a lot of pictures of broken branches here. They come out. And these hinged branches, broken branches are really common. And you have to pretty much, I would recommend you go through, if you have trees in your landscape, is go through before the leaves come on in the spring and just kind of give them a looking over to see if you have any dead branches or broken branches. Stubs. Now, I would never accuse any of you guys, because you guys aren't going to leave stubs now after watching the pruning presentation today. But sometimes, we're working with neighbors, or we purchase a place and it has trees that were pruned before, and we see a lot of these snags that were left. And I always go through and clean those up. Now, what's happened there is, I said earlier, and I've said several times, you always have to prune to a growing point or a living point. That should have been pruned here, closer to the tree. Instead, it was cut here, and then what happens is all of this area dies. So one of the things I look for is stubs, and I go through and clean up stubs, or I recommend people to clean up stubs. Other things to prune out, once you know, if you have insect and disease damage, let's say you've worked with your local extension office and they've identified fire blight, you need to get a recommendation from, if you need a recommendation and an identification, get that information and then prune accordingly. Sometimes it's best to leave the disease material on the tree, and sometimes it's better to remove it at the time, depending on the specific disease and time of year. But that's things to look for. That's a disease branch. We need to know what insect affected that branch, or what disease, or maybe it's just a broken branch. We need to know all of those things to make the decision whether or not to prune that. And time of year also plays into that greatly also. Other things to prune is branches that are really stacked on top of each other, especially those branches that are rubbing against each other, because just like people, with a wound, rubbing branches causes a wound, and wounds invites diseases and insect problems. So that's other things to look for in trees, and definitely take those out. Doesn't matter if it's a tree or a shrub. Anytime I see branches touching one another, when the wind blows, are going to rub against each other and probably create a wound that needs to be addressed. Things to prune out pretty much anytime during the year. Once again, we talked about root suckers. Here's a picture of a tree with a lot of root suckers, and those need to be removed, because what are they doing? They're not doing anything much other than taking energy from the tree. So if the tree is in pretty good health, when I see a lot of root suckers like that, some trees naturally have root suckers, but others, it can be an indication to me that there may be a problem with the tree that I'll investigate further. But in general, root suckers need to be removed. And it's amazing how many trees I see that look just like this when I'm driving around my local community, that people just let happen over time. They get used to it and they let the root suckers build up, and they're just there. They're a detriment to the tree. They're not serving any real function. We talked about water sprouts. Here's water sprouts in a tree. All of these little wispy growth. Now, water sprouts are most common when you've done a pretty heavy pruning. The next year, it's not uncommon to get a lot of water sprouts growing. And that's a scenario where you can take most of those water sprouts out, because they're going to crowd the interior of the tree. And just pruning for convenience. And primarily when I think of pruning for convenience, I think of, if you live in a city with a sidewalk, or you just are mowing around a tree and don't want to be smacked in the face every time with a low growing limb, that's pruning to convenience. That's a functional sort of pruning. A little bit more about making proper pruning cuts. Some very important things that I'll point out, first of all, is the branch bark ridge, which is this kind of area in here. And even more important is the collar of a tree. When you're making pruning cuts, if you're making a pruning cut to bring a limb all the way back to a tree, this becomes very important, because the collar is a kind of an area of specialized tissue in a tree. It's an area of the tree that has tissue that's rich in energy reserves. First of all. And that area can callus, or what we call healing. It's not really healing, but we call it callusing or healing. It's an area that can heal very quickly. And the last thing you want to do is cut that tissue away, because it's specialized tissue. You don't want to cut into the collar tissue. If I were making a pruning cut and heading this limb all the way back to the main trunk, the pruning cut would be here. Very carefully avoiding, you want to avoid this area, this swollen area. That is the bark, branch, ridge, and collar. You do not want to flush cut straight against the tree, and I see that a lot. You do not want to cut into that tree collar. Here's just another picture of another tree. Once again, you see this swollen area here. The pruning cut would be made here. And what I see a lot of times is the improper pruning cut would be here. People will come along, they want it to look nice and neat, so what do? We flush cut to make it look good, to make it look nice and flush. That is something you don't want to do. Another concept I'll point out here is that this limb is small compared to the trunk of the tree. And what that tells me, it has a nice collar, it has a lot of nice tissue here that I know is going to callus up very nicely. And this tree limb is small compared to the trunk. It's probably going to heal very nicely as long as the tree's healthy in general. Now, there's a lot of situations where there's no collar visible. What do we do then? Well, we still don't make a flush cut. What I generally recommend doing is coming out a little bit from the tree, and you make an angled cut. It may make an angled cut here where the red is. I'll show a better picture of that. Let's say that the tree part on the right is the one that's going to be removed. There's no real visible collar that I see here, and when I'm eyeing that angle, I don't want to flush cut here. That would be a no-no. We've talked about that. And I don't want to come all the way up here and leave sort of a stub. You don't want to do that. You kind of want to split the difference and make the pruning cut here at an angle. It'll shed water nicely. You don't want to make that angle too steep because you want to minimize the surface of that pruning cut, but that would be our pruning cut in these situations where no collar's present. And that would be a reduction cut in this situation, even though that's a really large limb. Here's what happens if you flush cut. You'll see the picture on the left there. The callusing's very uneven. In fact, some of that collar has been cut away, and where the collar's been cut away, you'll see no callusing, or very minimal callusing if you cut that collar away, and that's what happens. When you flush cut, that is what you get. Here I'll point out is that I try to minimize by pruning. If I'm planting a tree, I try to keep in mind that I don't want to prune out these low, big limbs later on in the tree's life, so I try to address that when they're young. But here's what happens if you don't do, or if you're not able to, or didn't have the tree when it was young. I see these situations here a lot, and that's probably either where a limb has died, broken out, or a huge limb, in comparison to the tree trunk, a huge limb has been pruned out and it let decay into the tree. So those low, big cuts can be avoided if you prune that tree when it's young, if you're lucky to be in that situation with a young tree. A little bit about, because it is sometimes necessary to remove larger limbs. I have a whole presentation for cities that just deals with pruning out larger limbs, but sometimes it's necessary to prune larger limbs, either because a storm came through, broke part of a limb out, or some other scenario. We can't always avoid pruning larger limbs, and I'll talk about a process to best deal with that. But have you guys ever seen this situation here where you see that's obviously that's been cut out? It didn't break out, it cut out. It's been cut. But what a person did was probably make a single cut. They started cutting here, I'm guessing. They started cutting here, and the limb had, in this case, the limb did have leaves on it, and it started to hinge down. And what did it do? It created a huge wound by creating a hinge of the bark, and that hinge ripped the bark as the limb fell. And you can avoid this with the 3-part pruning cut, but that's very common. Once you see this, you can't unsee it, and I see it a lot where there's large tree limbs that have been pruned. If you make just a single cut straight down on that limb, the odds are you're going to strip the bark. There's a way to avoid this. Here's another example where I saw damage here. but that's damage to the bark ridge and collar, and it creates a situation where the tree really can't callus up or heal. But how you avoid that is make a 3-part pruning cut. The first thing you do when you're going to remove a large limb all the way back to a trunk is first you make an undercut here, not all the way through, but you just cut part of the way through the limb. The second cut you make is here. You cut here, and what happens now is when this limb, this big limb that's out there, starts to hinge down, that bark will break away at this cut here and not make it down to the tree and strip down the side of the tree. That's what this cut's for here. Now, if we were to stop there, we would leave a snag. You don't want to do that. Your third and final cut is the final finishing cut here at the collar. And that's a 3-part cut. I use that cut several times a year, both at my own place, and I recommend it. To anyone cutting out large limbs is always make a 3-part cut. Now I want to switch gears just a little bit and talk about U-shaped crotch angles and V-shaped limb crotch angles in a tree. This is also a very big concept in tree pruning, and it helps you assess how weak or how strong a tree is. These are what I call V-shaped crotch angles, and by crotch angle I mean this. It's shaped like literally like a V. The limb is at a pretty extreme angle, at an upright angle, in consideration to the trunk of a tree. And what you get when you have V-shaped crotch angles, and notice this, go out and look. If you have these really tight angles, you'll see bark. If you start to look and very carefully on most trees, you'll see included bark here. It'll be like a pinched area that you'll see a kind of bark running up and down through there. And that creates a very weak situation in any tree, these V-shaped angles. The other angle that we have is a U-shaped angle, and it's a more open tree angle. These are good, strong limbs compared to V-shaped. I can just tell you that. They're not at such a severe angle, and when I look here, there's not nearly as much. When I look at this angle on the tree, there's not nearly as much included bark of the tree. And I'll have some better pictures here in a second of what exactly included bark is, but just remember, these V-shaped branch angles are not desirable because they're weaker. Now, I say that realizing that trees like, Bradford pear is probably the best example I can think of. If you look up in a Bradford pear, what are you going to see? V-shapes or U-shapes angles. You're going to see all V-shapes. First of all, it's a pear tree, and second of all, it's a Bradford pear. You know, there's other cultivars of those trees. Bradford's one of the worst because they have V-shaped angled limbs. Once again, another V-shaped angle here. If you have your choice and you're making decisions on what to prune out of a tree, if you have just a random limb that has a narrow angle, V-shaped angle, remove that. Once again, because all of this bark here, this what we call included bark, is very weak. Here's a cross section of a limb. I think the limb's actually been flipped over, but here's a cross section of why that's weak. Here is your V angle, and here's what it looks like when you cut it down the center. You basically have a cut in the tree. Now that cut's pretty well hidden here. The cut's hidden in the top picture for the most part, unless you know what you're looking for. But when you do a cross section of that, you can see that tree has a large wound. It has a cut that's never going to heal. It's not really a cut. It's just where the branches were pinched together, and they create a situation where disease and decay can get into. It's not a good situation. It's one that I try to look for early on when I'm looking at trees. And some types of trees like red maples that are soft wooded, when they get these type of V angles in the tree, they become very, very, very weak. And watch out for that. And here's what some of those angles, this was a limb that split apart that had a V angle, and you'll see this rod here. This rod sort of moved down the column of that wood, and that's as a result of these tight angles. That's a red maple, picture of red maple there. They're really bad for that. I think this was this is a Bradford pear, another example of a limb that split out due to these extreme branch angles. Now, how to prune a limb, if you have an opportunity to prune a limb, it's a little harder because there's no obvious collar when you're dealing with V-shaped angles. You just have to do the best you can. And what I normally recommend is just to make the cut a little bit up on the tree. A natural cut would be making a cut like this. You don't want to do that because it would expose too much surface, pruning surface. What you want to do is rather make the cut here and end up with something that looks like the picture on the right. And you can put a little bit more slope into that if you want, but not a lot of slope, because once again, if you're creating more slope, you're creating more wound area. So that's usually how I deal with V-shaped angled limbs, and that's how I prune them. The tree on the left here, once again, it's a younger tree. This is going back to codominant stems, which is an undesirable situation. On the tree on the left, you can see, first of all, it's competing with the central leader of the tree. This area is competing with the central leader. And the next thing to observe is something that's pretty common. It's got all this included bark from a V angle, and that's super weak. And now there's still time to correct this tree on the left fairly easily. You can correct that over the course of a couple of years, pruning that entire section out of that tree. You could probably correct it if the tree's healthy. Now this tree on the right, it's got several competing limb structures. They're codominant, they compete with each other. There's not a lot you can do once a tree gets that old. And you'll see once again this V-shaped angle here, and you'll see all this included bark. Here's a close-up, very weak. And if the wind blows hard, that'll be the first fail point of that tree, is that V angle. Here's a tree that has codominant stems, but it's a little bit better. It's a little better because this angle is a little wider and you don't have as much included bark in this area, so it's stronger. Here's a U-shaped branch angle. Once again, remember they're more desirable, U-shape. You'll see this picture on the right. We don't have that split in this area. We just have good clean wood. That's why more open or U-shaped angles are better in a tree. Just a few words about pruning evergreens. They are a little bit different. They're not as picky, but first thing I should say before I go over the next couple of slides is that with most evergreens, I try to give them plenty of room. Let's say I'm planting a white pine. I give it plenty of room so that I really don't have to do a lot of significant pruning past the third year on that tree, because evergreens for the most part have a very defined shape. We know the shape of that tree. You know, if you can picture a white pine in your head, it's going to be a kind of a, for the most part, a pyramidal shape with a central leader structure. But once again, I see a lot of white pines in neighborhoods that are planted and have codominant branches when it should have a central leader structure, and those aren't corrected. I see a lot of white pines especially like that in communities that you could take 5 minutes, correct that, and save you a lot of time, and you can save yourself from that tree felling at about 20 years old. But a little bit about pruning evergreens is the leafy evergreens can be pruned just about any time. They're not as picky about when to prune those. But for pine trees like white pines, trees like that, Virginia pines, all of those, if you do need to do some maintenance pruning on young trees, for the most part this applies to young trees, because when the trees get older, I don't do significant pruning on pines for the most part. But the time to prune those is prior. You'll see this pruning cut being made here. The candles have emerged and expanded, but the needles are still short. That's the time to prune. That's my favorite time to prune pines, is when the candles are there. And this is a candle. This is a pine candle here. And you'll see the little individual needles coming off here, and they've not yet expanded. That's a good time to prune. Now, some people, if they have a dwarfing version of an evergreen, this applies more to shrubs, but I included it in this presentation because it does have some application of trees. If you want to slow the growth of a evergreen for a dwarfing effect, you can prune after each growth flush. I don't think you should apply this principle to something like a white pine, for instance. They're the most common, or spruce, or any of those. You shouldn't apply that to that, because remember, those are big trees. You can't really dwarf those through pruning, unless it's bonsai, and then that's a whole different presentation that lasts about 3 hours. But for a dwarfing effect, prune after each candle flush growth of the candles, and it'll slow the growth of the tree and condense the tree. Sometimes I see people prune the candles to condense the growth of the tree, make it thicker. When not to prune evergreens is when the branches are frozen. That's not a good time to prune any tree because there's ice crystals. And when you prune, you break the cells, and that causes a lot of damage. You're not really cutting at that point. You're smashing. You're smashing that frozen tissue, and it creates a lot of tissue damage. Um, you don't want to prune a tree that's under great stress generally, unless you absolutely have to. And the most common situation of stress is drought. When a tree's under a lot of drought, you don't want to prune that tree then. It doesn't heal up as fast. And with evergreens particularly, check with your local extension office if you're going to be doing a lot of pruning on evergreens to make sure you're not pruning at a time when there's diseases or insects present, because a lot of times, particularly insects, they can key in on freshly pruned trees because pruning is a type of injury, and particular insects can kind of find those trees a little easier that have been pruned or injured. Last thing I'll go over, and I see this a lot here in Bourbon County, particularly on horse farms, where a lot of these farms I work with, they may hire a company to come in and they'll plant 100 red maples. And they'll plant those 100 red maples. I'll come one day and then come back the next day, and all of a sudden there's 100 trees planted. And I'm like, wait a minute. I know those weren't hand dug. They were planted with a mechanical planter. And what results from that a lot of times is these girdling roots. This is a girdling root, and it basically strangles a tree, cuts off the tissue of the tree, makes the tree weak, and the tree can, start to show, it usually starts to show symptoms if that's all the way around the tree or more than a third of the way around the tree. It'll show symptoms during drought, I guarantee you, if the root is girdling that tree. But girdling roots, I see that a lot. And in some situations, in this situation, there was mulch, the root was growing in the mulch because it was a path of least resistance. It was growing in that mulch, so it's easy to remove. And what I do is trace that root back to where it emerges from the tree. I'm not quite for sure, but let's say I'm pretending the root is growing out of this section of the tree. So I follow the root back and I prune there. And some people say, well, won't that hurt the tree? It'll hurt the tree less removing that girdling root than the girdling root itself would hurt the tree. So it's the lesser of two evils in this situation, removing that girdling root. Now, a lot of times girdling roots, they'll be underground. They're not going to be obvious. You're going to have to dig to find them. Here's some trees where girdling roots has caused issues. You'll see this pinched part here. And a real telltale sign of girdling roots is, and I see this time and again, and I look for it every time now, is that you'll see a tree like a maple that should have a base flare. It should go down as it approaches the ground. The base of the tree should flare out. When I see something like a red maple that goes straight into the ground like a pencil, it looks like a pencil you've stuck in the ground, I really suspect girdling roots in that scenario. Not always. But if the tree's not doing well, I see that the tree grows straight into the ground with no base flare. The first thing I look for is girdling roots to see if we can't correct that problem. And here's that tree that I showed earlier. The girdling root, of course, was there. That's been removed, and that tree was young enough. That's a red maple, I think. That tree's young enough is it's really going to be fine. That was a situation where the homeowner saw that girdling root was right on top of the ground and it was able to be corrected. That's usually not the case. It's sad but true. That's not the case. Those roots will be underground and you won't notice until you see the canopy start to wilt or die back or die completely. Just a general tree pruning summary to wrap things up here is that when I'm looking at trees, the first thing I look to remove is any dead wood in a tree. Then I look for broken wood, snags. I look for crossing or unsound branches because they create a lot of potential for future problems. And basically remove any branches that make the plant look better and address those branches. In that point, you'd address those branches that are, co-dominant when they're not desirable branches like that. But that's the summary of the presentation. That's when I walk up to a tree, that's my assessment. That's what I look for, and then I work from there, from general to specific on trees. With that, guys, I'm going to see if there's any questions. Jessica, Faye, Adam?
I have not seen any questions yet in the chat box, but feel free if you have a question to unmute yourself and just ask it like that, or if you're more comfortable typing it in the chat box, you can do it that way, whatever you prefer. We have a question. Why are they called water sprouts?
The high content of water to tissue, they grow very fast and they're primarily water based. If you look at those sprouts, they're very wispy, very bendy. They have a high water content. That was explained to me by a botanist years ago, Ralph Thompson, I believe at Berea, but he explained that that's why they're called water sprouts, and I'm going to take his word for it.
Great. Thanks. Lots of thank yous. Very informative. Do you have a fruit tree pruning presentation?
I do. And I don't know, Faye, remind me, is there open slots like later in the year? Maybe that's something we can get into at a little bit later time. I forget
Yeah,
what open slots are. I
for
can't
sure.
remember.
We can address that, but also I want to point out that we are doing a statewide program called Webinar Wednesdays.
Oh, yes,
And
that's
we
right.
have some classes laid out for February, and one of those is fruit tree pruning. So I
Wow.
believe that one is on, gosh, I'll have to look the exact date, but it'll be a Wednesday in February. If you need the information, feel free to email me. If you're on Facebook and you follow our pages, then you can find it on there. But
Is there a way
yes.
to get a link in today, I wonder, in the chat box?
Yeah. Good point there, Ray.
But I forgot all about that, Faye. Thank you. Yeah, now I look forward to that myself. And the good thing about it being in February is that's February and early March is when we do a lot of our fruit tree pruning. So that's perfect timing for you guys that have an interest in that. I look forward to that presentation myself. I
Yes.
forgot about that.
And we actually have several more questions. How do you prune water sprouts?
You just take them off at the top of the ground. Yeah.
And then when planting, do you remove the burlap thinking this would cause girdling?
I usually remove the burlap. It's been told to me that most burlap is biodegradable. I never quite trust that. That's just an old habit. Not only that, but I've worked with enough cities to know that sometimes trees are put in the ground with wire baskets still attached. And so as I remove the burlap, you know, if I'm walking up to a landscape, I look for wire, I look for burlap, and I cut all that away if I see burlap just as much as possible. If I see it on top of the ground, I cut it away, but it gives me something, it gives me an opportunity to do something even more important, and that's to look for rope. Because a lot of times burlap is tied with rope, and I will look for that rope on the root ball, and I'll remove all of that, you know, in the landscape, or recommend it be removed. So I just do it as a normal course of business. Yeah.
Excellent. And then when a large branch needs to be removed, does it help to make a first cut stub-like and follow in another year to get the final cut closer to the collar location?
It is, because it was the question if a tree is, if a limb's broken. Absolutely, because if you can't make the final cut that year, that's fine. You're not going to get significant decay in 1 year. Go ahead and remove the end of that branch, and then, you know, as long as you follow up in a year, you're fine. Yeah, that's still desirable than leaving a bad limb, a weak limb, a broken limb in the tree. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. And then what is the best time of year to prune fruit trees and ornamentals?
Once again, your ornamentals are based on that June 1. So to answer that question, you have to know when your ornamental blooms. And the same is true for most shrubs, that June 1, because if it's a late blooming tree or shrub, just think about when those buds are being set. If it blooms early in the spring, you prune after bloom, because if you prune before, you're pruning off the bloom buds. And the opposite is true for those that bloom late. If it blooms late, it sets buds later on that same year. You can prune very early in the spring before the buds are set. So you have to know when it blooms. So observe that or look it up based on whatever your tree is. And what was the second part of that question, Faye?
Best time, it was just best time of year to prune fruit trees and ornamental.
Yeah, fruit trees, as I mentioned, it's generally February and March when they're dormant. Now, a little bit of an exception that would be like a peach tree, because peach trees I recommend now to prune after that last hard frost, because with peach trees you'll get so many buds killed that I base my pruning on the number of living buds. So with peach trees, you prune those. I prune those a little later, but with like apples and pears, I prune those when they're still dormant in early spring.
Okay, more questions. Is a hanging branch any branch which grows on the underside of a branch?
Like branches that are stacked up on top. Nah, there's hanging branches that are kind of drooping or have some defect where they're not growing like they. If you look at that that hanging branch there, it is not like the others. It's a low growing branch or a branch that's growing at a negative angle. I don't want those because they're pointing down. Um, and a broken limb is just that, it's a broken limb. So a hanging branch to me is just a branch that's, a lot of times you'll just see a branch that grows down towards the ground, and I take those out generally. That's more what I call a hanging branch, one that's growing straight horizontal to growing down. They're not really desirable to me. I'll take them out.
Okay. And then another question is, if you have a larger tree and need to hire tree trimmers, are there certifications or other ways to determine if they know what they are doing? And that's a good question because
Yeah, I know we've all probably got that question, I guess, Faye. Well, the first thing I do is I'll just go online and do a quick search for Kentucky arborist. I don't know, Faye, is there better keywords? But yes, to answer your question, yes, the first thing I look for is that they have their arborist certification here in Kentucky. And there's a list. Once you get to that website, you can look it up based on your zip code, and I work from there because especially if you love your trees, I don't want trees just topped. I want to know that, so I want either personal recommendations or I want to know that they're a certified arborist and they know all of these principles we're talking about.
okay.
Because for the most part, arborists, I think they just do a fantastic job. I've never seen an arborist that I know of. Somebody may know of one, but I've never seen an arborist go in and just top a tree, not without some kind of special reason.
And I put in the treesaregood.org. I accidentally put .com the first one, but I just put in the link for treesaregood.org. And that website lists all certified arborists. You just put in your zip code and it'll list
Trees are
all
good.
certified arborists in your area.
Awesome. Perfect. I didn't know about that one. So
Mm-hmm.
that's got to be easier to find, because the one website, the certified arborist, the ISA, the certified arborist page is not real user friendly to navigate, or it wasn't the last time I checked it. So yeah, that's a good resource, Faye. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. How do you know which trees shouldn't be pruned to a central leader?
Uh, Basically, first of all, you identify the tree, and then you look up whether or not it should be a multi-stemmed tree. Once again, the example I gave was, what was it, a paper bark, or like the birches. A lot of times they're multi-stemmed, but the nature of those limbs, you can prune them to a central leader, but it's more of a natural form to them. Their natural growth habit is multi-stemmed trees. So the only way you're going to know that is first to identify the tree, and if you don't know what that is, maybe the extension office can help you out. Is to identify the tree and then do some research on whether or not that should be a multi-stemmed tree. And that's a great question. It's not always real easy, because I've looked at red maples and people would swear that that red maple is supposed to be a multi-stemmed tree, but it's not. And it's not always really easy to tell. That's a great question.
And then we had no walnuts or peaches this fall. Late frost the cause?
It could be. Usually when I get questions like that, I start to ask about the last 3 to 5 years history of the tree. If it was doing really well every year, there's been no disturbances to the ground or no pruning cuts made, the tree's otherwise been stable, and all of a sudden it doesn't produce, the first thing I start to try to backtrack is a late frost, yes.
Okay. And then someone commented he confused water sprouts with suckers at the ground, but he didn't answer water sprouts. I'm trying to think back to that question about water sprouts. I guess I'm not sure on that one.
Yeah, I'm trying to recall what.
But if anyone wants to chime in, where can I find the information about the fruit tree pruning? Need advice about fig trees.
Need advice about fig trees?
Yes.
We can send some. I do see fig trees more and more. They're becoming more common as they do better in colder temperatures. It seems like we may have a little bit of information on fig trees. We certainly get that question quite a bit. So someone just needing some info in general on fig trees.
I think so. And I know Adam Leonberger, one of our partners here in this session, or this whole session, I think they are doing a class on growing fig trees. Adam, are you there and can?
Yeah, it is.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah, we're having our master gardeners are doing a class on it in February 9th at 6 p.m. You can find it through either a Facebook or the Master Gardener Facebook, or our Master Gardener or our office webpage. Or our newsletter. Gigi Moffett is doing a whole class on growing fig trees in Kentucky.
Oh, awesome.
I've got I'm hoping if it goes through, I've got some cuttings that I'm hoping will take. I've never taken fig cuttings in the middle of winter, so we'll see what happens there. It might just be that they might be available to registrants after they actually root out.
Awesome.
Great.
I put this back up. I may have misunderstood the question or got it reversed, but I forget if the earlier question, I do remember that, if it was on suckers or water sprouts. Suckers can be removed at ground level, the sucker here, or if it's just on the side of the tree, you can very carefully, because they're small, prune it right to the tree. And if you have water sprouts, the same are true also. Those are so small, they don't have defined collars. It's a small cut, so you can remove those pretty close to the branch. They're young, they don't have collars, so that's where you would remove those. So water sprouts can be removed just about any time during the year, as long as you don't do it much after August. And suckers just about any time during the year also. But suckers, you either remove them at ground level, or if they're growing up right against the tree, sometimes they'll do that. On the tree, you can remove those right on the tree. Does that sort of answer that question? I may have got those confused when I was talking earlier. Water sprouts are up in the tree, root suckers are down on the ground.
Yes, I think that clarified.
Great, awesome.
Yep. And I'm not seeing any questions. Jessica, thanks for popping in all the links. She put in a link for Growing Figs, a publication there, and then a link to the webinar Wednesdays. I'm going to go ahead and put in another link to the webinar Wednesdays that's actually a sign up that goes directly to signing up for those. But what she put on there will also help you find the Facebook page or anything else. And if you ever need anything, definitely don't hesitate to contact Ray Tackett, who spoke today in Bourbon County, myself here in Woodford County, Jessica Sayer in Harrison County, or Adam Leonberger in Franklin County.
Thank you all so very much.
In whatever county you are in.